Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo.
And I remember being very surprised by that. It was a very striking difference when the black ministers came in and the way they were able to shape the debate and make suggestions about policies and analyze the situation, and how acceptable in a way that was to the black students.
Today on Reflections, Father Bacik talks with Sister Patricia Snapp, who is an associate professor of literature at Siena Heights College. Father Bacik and Sister Snapp will discuss black theology and the black experience. And now, here is Father Bacik.
Well, Pat, I'm glad that you have taken some time to be on the program with me. I want to speak a little bit about black theology, and I know that you know something about that topic because I'm one of the few people who ever read your dissertation on James Baldwin, a dissertation which I believe ought to be published someday. It's an excellent piece of work, but up till this point, I'm probably one of the 4 or 5 people in the world who have had the privilege of reading it, and in there you have some thoughts on black theology. And I want to pursue that a bit with you. And I want to try to get at the roots of black theology in the experience of the black church. That's the thesis I would like to pursue. It's usually a little hard to keep you on the topic, and therefore I thought I would sort of delimit it
Keep
carefully.
reminding me
That's right.
in the course of the program. That's
Yes.
very thoughtful, Jim.
So I want to talk a little bit about the black church experience as the basis for black theology. So do you want to begin to comment a little on that?
Certainly. How long do I have? Certainly, black theology, or black liberation theology, as it's called today very often, has its roots in the church of the pre-Civil War days, the black church experience in the South, the antebellum South. And liberation has always been a very, very significant theme for black Christians in this country. When they came over and, in a sense, were corralled into the Christian church, it was originally with the intent of keeping them docile and good slaves. And of course, they were often taught the Pauline texts about slaves being good to their masters and doing what they are told to do and so forth. But interestingly, what happened was almost a reversal of the intent, because, in fact, they took out of their new religion those texts which somehow helped them to survive, to put it very simply, and which kept alive their own hopes, which nurtured their own hopes for freedom. And so they focused in on those events and stories, and in particular the Exodus event, which showed them God as being on the side of the enslaved and the oppressed. And many of their hymns and songs and much of their preaching was based on what we would call today perhaps the liberation texts of the Old Testament.
Let's look at the history of that a little more closely. Pre-Civil War time, how did that all work out? I mean, did the slave masters establish churches for them at that time? Was that part of, as you said, that was part of their intent, but it was to use the religion as a way of keeping them in line. I mean, I think that's certainly been part of the black church experience, at least as it was set up by the whites, was a suggestion that, well, if you live properly now and live according to your proper station and status in life, then you'll be rewarded in heaven someday. It was sort of a utopian kind of preaching as I understood it. But I guess I'm a little foggy on the history there before the Civil War. Are you in touch with that?
Yeah. It would be white preachers who would preach to the black slaves of a particular plantation, who would be gathered ordinarily just in a meeting spot. It might simply be a cabin. And the texts would often be Pauline, although the Bible was read from both the Old and the New Testament. And after a while, as the blacks became more familiar with the book, although many of them, they could not, of course, they were not able to learn to read. They were forbidden to learn to read, but they memorized texts. And they, early on showed the ability to memorize vast texts from the gospel and from the scriptures, I should say, and the ability to preach. And so after a while they were allowed to hold the services by themselves. They would come together and with their own particular style, creating hymns, they were allowed to and it would be the only time actually during the week when they would be together and would not be under the supervision of any of the white masters. And so it was when they were alone primarily that the preachers would seize upon the opportunity to focus in on those texts which fed the hope for freedom in them. And such hymns as Go Down Moses, Way Down to Egypt Land, Tell Old Pharaoh, Let My People Go, of course, always had the double meaning of being a plea for freedom out of slavery for the people even then. And scholars say now that most of the hymns, in fact, were thinly disguised freedom songs, although ostensibly they were perhaps written about the experience of the Israelites down in Egypt land. And that even references to Canaan, that Canaan was sort of a code word for Canada, which always meant freedom. So going home to Canaan would mean going up to freedom land.
And they composed these hymns themselves out in
right.
that sort of setting.
That's right. Sometimes in the fields, but very often spontaneously within the church service. And there are beautiful descriptions of how these came to be written on the parts of whites who would occasionally be attracted to go to a black service simply because of the Pentecostal emotionalism that tends to characterize the black religious experience. The getting of the spirit, the singing and clapping and dancing and so forth.
Tell me about the relationship with the indigenous African religions. Did some of that was that maintained in the black church experience? And I'm thinking about other places where people have been Christianized, like Latin America.
Yeah.
They will talk about how what you end up with is almost an amalgam of Christianity and the native Indian religions and so on. I'm wondering how much of that has occurred in the black church experience.
Well, a great deal has occurred. And there are some scholars who even question whether black Christianity in this country is in fact true Christianity because of the presence of so many elements and because of the absence of other elements that tend to characterize Euro-American Christianity. There hasn't been enough work done yet on the connection, but one of the big connections certainly is in the style of the worship, the getting of the Spirit, being seized by the Spirit, caught up in the Spirit, and often thrown down on the floor of the church. The experience of the trance-like state, the ecstasy. But getting the Spirit is a very West African, it's a part of the West African religious ritual, and it would always be one or two, just a couple that would be chosen by God, as it was believed, at any given gathering. And the others would characteristically dance and pray around those who had had the Spirit, just as happens in a black church today, that the others will pray them through the trance or the powerful religious experience. The style of music, the hand clapping, the involvement of the body, the rich range of emotions, from grief, the heavy expression of grief, the weeping, the crying, the lamenting, but also the experiences of joy, the dancing and jumping, the use of the tambourine and other rhythm instruments. All of these are very West African.
And have worked their way into the black church experience.
Yes, have been part of the continuum. Strong belief in the West African religions, always in God, but in a sense in a whole animated world, in the presence of many gods, the presence of the ancestors, a strong belief in the presence of the spirit world generally, and therefore, sort of by extension, an enormous belief in the symbolic significance of various manifestations of nature, of divinity in trees and rocks and stones and rivers and so forth. And so the strong sense of the interpenetration of the spirit world with ordinary life, which tends to characterize black Christianity in this country today, is another element that was brought over from the West African religions.
So you're suggesting that this has remained part of their church experience throughout.
That's right.
I'm thinking of one time when I preached
Belief in ghosts, for instance.
Preached in a black church. I guess that was one of the highlights of my preaching career, to go there and to be part of that service. In other words, it had so many different features from what I would have been used to. I remember at one point asking the minister, well, when does this start? And he says, well, it's already started. People were singing and so on. And, well, when am I supposed to go out there? And he says, well, whenever you're ready, you can go out. And I mean, it was a marvelous experience. You know, when you're talking about the Spirit there, I was thinking about that.
Yes.
The sense of the Spirit, the spontaneity of the service was very telling in my mind. And then the responsiveness of the congregation. I was told that I could preach for just about as long as I wanted to. I mean, that was a new kind of experience. I'm usually limited to 11 minutes in my church. And it's interesting when we exchange pulpits with that particular black minister, he always is amazed that we want him to give his sermon in 12 minutes or something.
As if you can somehow rein in the Spirit when the Spirit starts speaking.
Exactly. Well, what I found there when I did that was that the people were very responsive. And I asked him ahead of time whether it would be offensive in any way if I sort of fell into their patterns. And he said, no, that was, perfectly all right. And so it happened just as you see it on television or whatever, where the people encourage the preacher with amens and tell him, Reverend, and when I would mention a particular text in the Bible, they would page through and find the text that I was talking about and so on. And I mean, it was a tremendous feedback as one was going through it. I often thought what he must feel when he came to our church, and everyone's sort of sitting there and making no movements and saying nothing. It must be
like
very
they're
hard.
Comatose.
Yeah, it must be hard for him to preach in that setting. But I found it to be an outstanding experience because of the interaction and the sense of community that was created. And then they seemed like they wanted to encourage you to preach the word and wanted you to get it right. And when you said it, when you're on target, they let you know it right away. And I found that to be very helpful. And I think I preached about 45 minutes or something. It was an amazing experience. And then the other things, I remember them coming up around the altar and praying spontaneously and all at once and out loud. And that again was it seemed to be a manifestation of what you were saying. I'm trying to pick up on that idea that they were very conscious of the presence of the Spirit in their worship services.
And unself-conscious.
Yes, and able to just go with the flow and
That's right.
to respond spontaneously to whatever was going on. So there is a distinctive experience there. And let's go back to the hymns that you were talking about, because I think that the hymns are a great shaping influence in the black community. Of course, that's one of the great contributions of the black community, I think, to American culture, the gospel singing, and some people are familiar with that, either being at services or we have black gospel choirs around or see it on television and so on. And it's a very foreign form to many people, but I think probably does have sort of a universal aspect to it. Do you want to comment on any more on the hymns?
Well, only, I suppose, insofar as the hymns would be carried. Once a hymn was formed and would be learned almost instantly and perhaps improvised on and added to, very often it would be taken out into the field and it would be sung in the course of the week's work. And again, it became, the bards who shaped these, the unknown bards, as James Wendell Johnson calls them, black and unknown bards, they would feed the hopes of freedom, and they would be, again, a form of sustenance, a sort of emotional nourishment during the course of the week. And through the veiling of the religious texts, the slaves were actually able to then sing about their hope for freedom and their trust in the God who had rescued the Israelites from Egypt and the Pharaoh, and their hope that a new Moses would come and would save them.
Were the white slave masters aware of this liberating power of this black church experience, do you think?
Some of them were, and certain hymns were forbidden that focused too explicitly on the theme of freedom. And so they were tolerated to a certain point, but at the same time, in some places, and sometimes, from what I have read, certain hymns were simply outlawed, were not allowed to be sung.
So they were at least in tune with some of the potential power involved.
That's right.
But the other thing you were saying, that there was a certain subtlety about it that maybe escaped the master.
That's right. I guess I'd just like to add that while the black preachers could most explicitly feed the hope of ultimate liberation when blacks were meeting just by themselves, that these black gatherings often became the seedbeds for various revolutions, small revolts, such as, for instance, Nat Turner's. And so eventually, because they were the seedbeds of these uprisings, in many of the states, it was forbidden at various points for blacks to come together even for prayer without the presence of a white person, because of the potential for this sort of volatile stirring up of the hope of freedom on the part of the congregation.
Was that known in the story of Nat Turner, that the church experience was part of that had fed the rebellion?
Absolutely. In fact, it was partly because of Nat Turner's rebellion and various other rebellions that had been instigated and formulated within the prayer experience of the slaves on a given plantation, that blacks were forbidden to meet without the presence of a white, so that they could be monitored and what was being said by the preacher could be monitored. At the same time, many scholars have said most black preachers used the power they knew they had judiciously, because they knew that any uprising was virtually suicidal. It was almost bound to be suicidal. But
I have the impression that the black church experience is still powerful among blacks today. I'm thinking of experience at another university where there was difficulties, racial kind of difficulties, and we were, as white ministers, were called in to try to help out with this problem and so on, and we're dealing with the black students and trying to find ways to reconcile. And at some point, the black ministers were called in to the meetings that were being held, and I remember the great reverence which the students showed towards them, and even a certain docility that really surprised me in that situation. They had great respect. I would say the kind of respect maybe that Catholic clergy had a number of years ago among the immigrants, and probably isn't enjoyed to the same degree, or I should put it, not in the same way these days. And I remember being very surprised by that. It was a very striking difference when the black ministers came in and the way they were able to shape the debate and make suggestions about policies and analyze the situation, and how acceptable in a way that was to the black students. I saw a certain docility, it seems to me. And this is going back maybe 10 or more years, and I really don't know how it is now. But my point was that it appears as though the black church experience still is powerful in a way in that community that maybe we've lost in the white community.
I would agree. I've been, as you know, a jail chaplain here in Toledo for 20 years, I guess. And I have found very few black prisoners who have no religion. It doesn't matter what they have done or been into. What has always come clear when they have come to the services, and I must admit this is maybe strange, maybe it's a little unfair to generalize, because they aren't forced to come to the services, so those who do come willingly and want to pray. But regardless of what their history has been or what has brought them to the jail, the faith seems extremely deep, and the respect for religion and for their own religious past has always been very, very strong. And I suspect that you are right. I think in general, from my experience with students over a number of years, that skepticism, agnosticism, and sort of a cavalier attitude toward religion or indifference seems to be far less characteristic of the black students I have had than of the whites, or seems to be present in smaller percentages.
Mm-hmm. There's another aspect of the experience that I get from the contemporary scene, and that is watching Jesse Jackson campaign in the black churches, where there doesn't seem to be any big worry about the separation of church and state, and where political matters can be addressed within the church setting without any difficulty. I mean, it's almost expected. It's as though a world is created there. When Jesse Jackson walks into a black church to give, maybe it's a sermon, but it's all sort of melds together, it seems to me, in terms of being a political statement or a sermon. And everyone understands the language. Everyone understands the symbols. People seem to be at ease. He can press the buttons, and the emotional responses are there. Again, it seems as though there's a closer welding together of the political and the religious within that community. Or maybe put it this way, there's less of the distinction that we would usually associate in our white churches. I mean, a lot of that I don't think could happen in the white community. In fact, it probably would be questioned by a number of people for various reasons. There would be a lot of the people in the congregation who would say, this isn't right to have a candidate come in here and give what amounts to a political speech. And so maybe here's another distinctive characteristic of the black experience. That wouldn't surprise me, because I think the churches have carried the political message. That's why black theology, I think, has a sort of built-in political dimension. I mean, they're not afraid to deal with that. Oh, I'm sorry, I haven't given you a chance for a while. Go ahead.
I want to say something. You know, we think of the civil rights movement and all of the black ministers who were at the helm. You're shaking your head.
Go ahead.
Dismay.
Go ahead.
Can I? Thank you. I think perhaps this is true because in the black church, the ministers are not accountable to anyone but their own black congregations, and therefore they had a freedom to speak out against racism, to speak for liberation, for civil rights, in a way that, for instance, a token black politician or lawyer or even university professor would not have had. And so their very profession freed them up. I mean, they were in the one institution where blacks, in fact, had the power, namely the black church. That's not true of any other institution in this country. And so perhaps that is one of the reasons there has been the correlation, along with the fact, of course, that the Bible has been such a wonderful source for stories of liberation, or in the New Testament for stories of how to deal with suffering. You know, the stories of the suffering Messiah who ultimately triumphs. And these have been the sustaining stories for the black community and their history in this country.
Are you finished with that segment?
Did you lose your train of thought?
Did you get that? You got that point in. Yeah. I was just trying to make this concrete again, and the person I would know this through would be Martin Luther King. There's a trend in scholarship on King among black scholars these days. I've had the opportunity to talk with some of them and or to get their ideas, and that is the importance of the black church experience in understanding Martin Luther King. I mean, he grew up, his father, of course, was a minister, and he grew up in that setting. By the age of 6, he already knew the hymns by heart and large segments of the scriptures by heart, and it's sort of that became part of him. It was built into his bones and his blood, and I think it flowed out so easily. When he spoke spontaneously years later, it would be those biblical phrases and those images from the hymns that would seem to come to his mind so easily. And of course, he himself became a preacher, a minister in the church at a very young age. So all of that, the scholars now tell us you can't understand Martin Luther King just by looking at what he wrote his dissertation on when he went to Boston University, that there's a lot more to it than that, and that you'll never understand him unless you see how he was shaped by this black church experience.
I have to just mention that there's something very musical in what we tend to associate with many black preachers' style of preaching, the rhythmic cadences, which again suggests the deep association of powerful rhythms within the black church experience and their expression of faith, their own spirituality. And it comes out in these powerful rhythmic cadences of Martin Luther King or of Jesse Jackson. And this is a way, of course, of passing on the Spirit, because the more emotional we become, the more rhythmic we become, and vice versa. And it's a way in which I think Martin Luther King and Jackson have been able to move their audiences. They've been in control of a power that has not been evenly distributed among all political figures.
That's for sure. And I often think of the way Martin Luther King used that power judiciously, and how he always was careful in a way not to inflame the congregation, and how often when he felt that happening, he would come forward with a cautionary message about be careful not to become violent about this, and we have to channel this energy and so on. And Martin Luther King would be an example of a theologian, and I think he was that, a very public theologian, an activist theologian, but one who would represent the way the black church experience could be translated into a theology. In other words, I think a lot of what he said and how he responded to people give us a theological notion, a particular slant on God and how we are to relate to God. And he's clearly a perfect example in my mind of one who grew out of that experience. And of course that gives you a sense of integrity then. It's like when people from other ethnic backgrounds do theology out of their roots, you see a sense that there's something to it, that there's an integrity there. Do you have any other points along this line that you would want to get in? We have only less than a minute to go here yet, so you have to compress your idea if you want to.
I just like that one idea that black theology is theology done out of the black experience, rather than off in an ivory tower somewhere or at a seminary. And I'll let you say the concluding words.
Okay. And I think what we were trying to do is to see how that theology relates to the specific experience of the church. And in that regard, a number of things seem to be clear. One is that relationship to the political order, that there's an integration about it, that religion and politics are intertwined. And I think the other thing that you brought out so well, that the soul and the body are intertwined. There's an integrity. And so it comes out in the clapping and in the powerful hymns that they sing. So maybe one of the lessons we learn about theology from all that, from the black experience, is that it ought to be integrated. It ought to hold together and touch the whole person.
You've been listening to Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo. Today, Father Bacik talked with Sister Patricia Snap, who is an associate professor of literature at Siena Heights College. The topic of this week's Reflections was Black Theology and the Black Experience. If you have any comments on today's show or suggestions for future programs, please write Father James Bacik, Catholic Campus Ministry, 2086 Brookdale Drive, Toledo, Ohio, 43606. Funding for this program was provided by the Catholic Communications Commission of the Diocese of Toledo.